Evening. Welcome to tonight's talk through the East Hampton Library. Um, Tonight we have Laura through 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 correct me if I'm wrong, Trethewey, who will be discussing her latest book, The Deepest Map. Uh, we will leave the floor open for questions at the end. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to type the questions in the chat, or if you'd like to use the raise hand feature, we'll unmute you when we get to the end of the talk tonight. What I'd like to do is just mention a little bit about The Deepest Map. The Deepest Map chronicles global mapping efforts around the world and the increasingly fraught question of whether and how to mine the deep sea. And in this particular talk, what will be covered is the history and future of deep sea mining, as well as the science, the industry, and political developments taking place in open mapping today. And without further ado, I'd like to turn over the talk tonight to our speaker.
Steve, and thank you so much to the East Hampton Library for inviting me to talk about my new book, The Deepest Map. Libraries and librarians are just the greatest invention of all time, in my opinion. I couldn't have become a writer without them. So I'm very happy to be here and talk about my work. I also wanted to give a special thanks to Cheryl Gold, who's been a great supporter of mine and helped organize tonight's talk. So I am got a little PowerPoint presentation here today to show you some scenes from the reporting that I did for this book and tell you a few stories from inside the making of it. So just bear with me a moment while I share my screen. Okay. Oopsies. It's okay if I leave the little thumbnail video up there in the corner. Can everyone see that? Does that look okay for you? Okay, good. I think I'm gonna get a nod from Cheryl, so we're good. Okay, so I'm just going to, here's the cover of my book and my website. If anyone would like to get in touch, I'll circle back to that at the end. And so I'd like to start off tonight's talk by introducing you first to an ocean mapper, Cassie Bongiovanni. And many of you have probably never heard of her, but she is a main character in The Deepest Map. And she's done extraordinary things that really no one else in the history of humanity has ever done before. And she did them when she was less than 30 years old. So Cassie was the lead ocean mapper on the Five Deeps, which was this expedition to send the first person to the deepest points of all 5 oceans. And the problem was that when this expedition first started back in 2019, no one knew where the deepest points of all 5 oceans were. So we knew that the Pacific Ocean's Challenger Deep was the deepest point on the planet, but the rest of the deeps were pretty much a big mystery. And I remember when I first found out about that really early on in reporting the book, I found it really astonishing. Like, why don't we know that? How have we mapped, the human genome and sent robots to Mars, but we don't even know the limits of our planet? And so Cassie gets herself a job on this expedition, and she goes off to find the deepest points of all 5 oceans. And at the time, she's 25 years old. She's fresh out of university, and she goes away for about 1.5 years on this privately funded expedition, paid for by this multimillionaire financier, Victor Vescovo, who paid millions of dollars to buy a ship and build a state-of-the-art submersible that would get him to the bottom of all 5 oceans. And if you've heard of 5 Deeps, you've probably heard of Victor, because he tends to get a lot of the glory for this expedition, but because he's now the world record holder. But it's Cassie, who's this sort of shy and humble and sort of goofy millennial mapper who did the lion's share of the work behind the scenes, finding him those deepest points to dive. And in my opinion, Cassie is sort of a hidden figure in the world of ocean exploration. This picture was taken in the Indian Ocean, and this is right around the time that Cassie discovers that the deepest point in the Indian Ocean is not the Diamantina Fracture Zone, which is off Australia. That's what everyone thought it was, but it was rather hundreds of miles away in the Java Trench off Indonesia. So in this picture, she's basically just like casually upending all this foundational knowledge that we have about an entire ocean, which I think is really extraordinary. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see this next slide. The book is following Cassie's quest to look for the deepest points of all 5 oceans, but it also branches into this other quest, this larger quest called Seabed 2030. And this organization pops up around the same time that Cassie goes to sea in 2019. And Seabed 2030's mission is to finish the first complete map of the ocean by the end of the decade, so 2030. And at this point, less than 20% of the global ocean was mapped with high resolution multi-beam sonar. So we have very grainy maps of the ocean, complete grainy maps of the ocean made by satellites, but sort of the high resolution multi-beam maps, we only had about 20% of them, of the global ocean. And Seabed 2030 said that it wanted to map the rest of the ocean in about 13 years. So that was about 80% in just over a decade. And this map that I've got up right now, this was made by one of the ocean mappers behind Seabed 2030. And she made it in 2019. And it really puts into context what we've mapped so far versus what we haven't mapped, and what Seabed 2030 is up against when they say they want to finish mapping the entire ocean. So all the black stuff is uncharted waters. They've never been mapped by sonar. In some cases, a ship has never gone there at all in the history of ocean exploration. And the colored bits around the coastlines and those sort of lines connecting continents, those are the shipping routes. So you can see that's where we've decided to map. So you can see around Europe and off the coast of the US, very well mapped waters. But then there's just huge sections of darkness. So at this point, you might be asking why we haven't mapped the seafloor, or even more basic, how do we map the ocean floor? On land, we map by measuring the speed of light, but mapping with lights and lasers doesn't work in the ocean because all that deep, dark ocean absorbs the light. So we have to map with sound, because sound is transmitted very well in water. And the best way to make a map of the seafloor today is still to go out on a ship, have your sonar attached to the bottom and send a ping down to the seafloor. And it bounces off the seafloor and then it returns to the ship's sonar. And 1 second of travel time is equal to about a mile of depth. So it's sort of a basic overview. It sounds totally easy, right? But a lot of things can complicate that measurement. So there's the water salinity, there's the temperature, there's the pressure, there's all these other factors that are warping the ping as it travels down through the ocean, back to the bottom, down to the bottom and back up again. And then there's the ocean mapper who's sitting on board a ship, and she's got waves and water and wind and things are breaking down. And so it's just really hard, really complicated work. And that's what Cassie was doing when she was out on the ocean with the 5 deeps. And that sort of also helps explain why we haven't finished this map right here, because the ocean is huge. It's 71% of the planet, and there's really nothing else on land that I can compare it to, because the ocean is just so much bigger than anything we know about on land. It's a really tough, really huge space to wrap your head around. It's also important to remember that what we're seeing right here is just the surface of the ocean. So when we talk about 71% of the planet being ocean, that's just the surface. But the ocean is a 3-dimensional space, so it's also very deep. It's about 2.5 miles deep on average. So this size makes it really expensive to map with a survey ship. CBID 2030 actually estimated that a finished map of the seafloor would cost around $3 billion to $5 billion. And that might sound like a lot, but it's roughly the same cost as sending the rover Perseverance to Mars a few years back. However, that number was put out in 2019, and a lot of stuff has happened since then. So with inflation, that number has probably doubled by now. But all that goes to say, practical reasons aside, we can map the entire seafloor if we wanted to. We've had the technology to do it for decades. It's very challenging, it's expensive, but we've done lots of challenging and expensive things, so we could do this. And that's the big question that I'm exploring in the deepest map. You know, why haven't we done this? And what would it take to finally finish this map? So when people ask me, what's the point of doing ocean mapping? Like, why are we even doing this? I like to bring up Marie Tharp. And she's someone else that I see as very much a hidden figure in ocean exploration, really a precursor to Cassie Bongiovanni. So Marie was a cartographer at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory in upstate New York. So not too far from you guys. And she was there during the post-war Cold War period. And she was a bit of a curious character for her time. She's a divorcee. She's working in science at a time when women were not welcome in the sciences at all. At the same time, there were also a lot of phenomenal leaps and bounds being made in ocean mapping back then, thanks to the Cold War and to anti-submarine warfare that was going on. And so Marie finds herself in the right place at the wrong time. And the biggest hurdle for her is that she's not allowed to go to sea to survey the seafloor herself, because women are not allowed on any research vessels in the US at that time. At Lamont, they weren't even allowed on the gangplank. So Marie has to find a way around this restriction, and she does that by forging this sort of part scientific, part romantic partnership with another scientist called Bruce Heason. And Bruce goes out and collects the soundings at sea, and he brings them back to Marie on land, and she takes them and sort of painstakingly plots them on a map. And one of the first things she notices is that there's this big ridge in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's going all the way down the ocean. And it immediately dawns on her that this is where new Earth is bubbling up out of the center and pushing continents further and further apart. Now, today, we all know that continental drift is true, that there was once a big supercontinent called Pangaea. But back in the 1950s, in American geological circles, it was really a career killer to believe in continental drift. Scientists who did were called drifters, which is sort of like calling someone crazy. But Marie keeps drawing those maps, and new soundings are coming in, and she's finding more and more evidence of this ridge all over the ocean. It's in the Atlantic, but then it continues into the Indian Ocean, the Southern Ocean. It's all over the Pacific. It's all over the world, in fact. It's 40,000 miles in total. And then this map comes out in 1967, and it's published in National Geographic as sort of this, you can sort of like pull it out of the centerfold. And I've actually got it up there on my wall too. It's a map of the Indian Ocean, obviously. It's painted by an Austrian painter, but it's based on the maps that Marie's been drawing for nearly 2 decades at this point. And this map is really the first modern glimpse of the seafloor that the public has ever seen. And it comes out in 1967, and it's this sort of, that's a very pivotal year in geological circles, because there's this big debate going on around continental drift. People are starting to accept it. But then there's also this new emerging theory of plate tectonics. And this map, when it comes out, it sort of paves the way for scientists, but also the general public, to accept and understand that these two theories are correct, because everyone can see it right there on the map. You can clearly see this sort of mid-ocean ridge running through the Indian Ocean. And just in general, you know, the seafloor is not dead, boring earth in this picture. You know, there's a lot going on. There's mountain chains and valleys, and there's, you know, ridges and trenches and interlocking plates. And, you know, the whole surface of the planet is really on the move here. And Marie's maps gave us this new earth-shattering view of the seafloor. And it really changed the world and changed our view of the world. So I'm gonna switch topics here for a second. I have a bit of a confession to make. Before I wrote The Deepest Map, I had never spent a serious amount of time at sea. I'd been on a cruise before to Greece, but I was a bit embarrassed to call myself an ocean journalist because I'd never been on a real ocean expedition. So at one point during the reporting of the book, it became really obvious to me that my lack of experience at sea was really hampering my reporting. I'd exhaustively interviewed Cassie and so many other scientists and ocean mappers and crew on board these ships. But I found my mind kind of kept snagging on like a few critical questions about the ocean, like just very basic questions like, you know, how big is the ocean? Why is it so hard to map? And I realized I really needed to go to sea myself if I ever wanted to understand what Cassie and Seabed 2030 were really doing. And at nearly really any point over the last 20 or 30 years, it would have been relatively easy to do this, to find a spot on a ship. Scientists generally like to talk about their work just as much as writers do. But because I was reporting this book at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, it was almost impossible to find a ship to take me. And so all the research vessels, they had cut their ship staff down to, you know, the bare minimum, skeleton crews, just enough people on board to operate and conduct science. There were so many researchers desperate to gather data at this point in time, and there was just not a single berth to spare for, you know, a writer to come aboard. So I waited about a year, emailed a bunch of people, talked to a bunch of people, and then I eventually did get a berth on board this ship, Nautilus, which was running a mapping cruise up the west coast of California from LA to Astoria. So this is just before we were about to leave from Long Beach in LA. And I was very nervous about this trip for a couple reasons, but mostly that I was unsure whether I got seasick or not. And at this point in time, the crew was telling a lot of horror stories of first-timers who come on board and they're so seasick that they spend the entire time in their room just throwing up. So I was a bit terrified. And then we had really rough weather. We had really horrible weather while we were out there. This is the first time we were able to actually go out on the ship decks after a pretty big gale. We were at this point trying to map off Point Conception, which is this really rough bit of Pacific, and you're lucky if you get around it without a gale happening. and we were not lucky. It was really bad. But I found out, luckily, that I did not get seasick, which was great. We were out there for 9 days. We mapped about 4,000 square kilometers of seafloor. That's about the size of Rhode Island. And of those 4,000 square kilometers, about 426 square kilometers was new seafloor that had never been mapped before. So that seafloor, 426 square kilometers, that's really tiny, considering how much seafloor is left to map. It's really a drop in the bucket. But Nautilus is partners with Seabed 2030. So everything that we mapped on board that ship went into the giant super map of Seabed 2030. And, I think I got what I wanted going out there. When we got out to sea, it was really helpful for me to see just how big the ocean is. I mean, I hear it all the time. I'm an ocean journalist. The ocean is so big, it's 71% of the planet. But it's really different to go out there yourself and to see no land on the horizon. It's just water and sky. And you realize that this is the majority of the planet, and this is what it looks like. And we are really small in comparison. And so that was really helpful for me to finally get that experience and communicate that in the book. Okay, so ocean mapping sounds really hard, right? People are going out to sea for weeks at a time. They're getting slammed around by gales and waves. And, do humans actually need to go out to sea and do this? Is there some way that AI or robots could automate any of this process? And it turns out that drones are a really big push within the industry right now. So this is me in Alameda, near San Francisco, at this startup company called Saildrone, which is doing incredible things with ocean mapping drones. So they are sending drones like unassisted across the Pacific, across the Atlantic. They've sent a drone, without a human on board around Antarctica. And this kind of stuff is, one ocean mapper called it like black magic. Like nobody could have imagined that anybody would be able to do this just a few years ago. And ocean mappers are really excited about drones because they're cheaper, they're less heavy on diesel fuel, they're more accessible to poor countries that would really benefit from improved maps. A survey vessel costs about $50,000 a day, so it is just not within reach for many countries in the world. And another kind of interesting benefit is that drones are never going to operate entirely by themselves. There's always going to be a human back on land monitoring the drone, which means that anyone, anywhere in the world with an internet connection could be an ocean mapper. But of course, I'm a romantic, and I grew up reading stories about sailors on the high seas. And to be honest, robot drones mapping the ocean was a little bit depressing to me. During the Victorian era, explorers used to dream about making all these amazing seafloor discoveries. And so I found myself kind of just thinking, like, why would we give that job to a robot? Like, I didn't get it. So over the years I spent writing this book, I started to keep a list of all the seafloor discoveries that were happening. And eventually that list, it got so big and so long that I had to just trim it down to a few highlights. So in 2020, this won't be an exhaustive list, a ship discovered a coral reef taller than the Empire State Building in Australia in the Great Barrier Reef. In 2021, a team of scientists landed on this uncharted island in the Arctic Ocean that turned out to be the world's northernmost landmass. And this team thought that they were actually on a different island, and they only realized months after the expedition that they had discovered a new island when they looked at maps and realized that the island had literally just popped out of the ocean, which actually happens a lot more than you might expect. And then in 2022, you might have heard of this, an international team discovered the final resting place of Ernest Shackleton's ship's Endurance off Antarctica. So that's a picture of its stern at the bottom of the ocean. And keep in mind, these are just the greatest hits of the last few years. Many of these discoveries happened completely randomly. Obviously, the Endurance, people went looking for that, but most of these things are just happening completely out of the blue, totally random discoveries. And that's really why I love ocean exploration and ocean mapping, is because it's really one of the few scientific fields where you can make these totally basic, fundamental discoveries. You know, the kind of stuff that Victorian explorers used to just stumble across a couple hundred years ago. And one of my favorite mysteries that I want to talk about the seafloor is that we still haven't figured out where life began on Earth. We know it started somewhere on the ocean floor many, many years ago, and it probably happened at a hydrothermal vent like this one. Hydrothermal vents are essentially underwater hot springs, and there's a rip or a rift in the seafloor, and all this mineral-rich water bubbles up out of the Earth's molten layer. And the first one was discovered in 1977. Back then, we thought all life was photosynthetic, so that it needed, life needed the sunlight. It needed sunlight to survive. And then suddenly this team in the 1970s discovered all these animals clustered around an underwater hot spring miles under the ocean, and they were feasting off minerals in the water in total darkness, very little oxygen. And this just upended our entire understanding of life on Earth. You know, that life could be chemosynthetic and that it could survive totally off chemicals. And since then, ocean expeditions have found hydrothermal vent fields all over the world. I think there's about, I forget how many, 300 or something at last count. This one is in the Atlantic, and it's called the Lost City. It's one of the most beloved hydrothermal vent fields in the ocean. And it has these really charismatic vent chimneys that are standing almost 200 feet from the Atlantic seafloor. And that's an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle, that's exploring it right there. And the scientists that explore these places, they reckon that there's maybe 30,000 years worth of hydrothermal activity in this field alone. So things have just been bubbling away for years and years and years. And it's one of the best candidates in the world for where we might discover the beginnings of life on Earth. So one question I heard a lot while I was writing was writing about Seabed 2030 and writing the deepest map was people often ask me, what are we going to do with this map when we finish mapping the seafloor? When people think about maps, they often think about mining and colonialism. They think about kings and empires sort of waging war or seizing lands. And when I started researching the deepest map, there was a lot of concern that Seabed 2030 was going to accelerate deep sea mining by creating the first publicly available maps of the seafloor. Because those maps would, pinpoint where these resources are, and anyone might go exploit them. But then I found out that deep sea miners already had good maps of the areas they intended to mine. They'd had those maps since, the 1970s or 1980s. And Seabed 2030 is really just, it's an academic venture. So it doesn't have the money to map the whole seafloor by itself. It has to rely on governments or the military or companies. So in some cases, deep sea mining companies donate maps to the Seabed 2030 giant super map of the world. So it's really kind of going the opposite way than what I thought. So this is a picture of a deep sea mining machine called a nodule collector. And it's about the size of an army tank, and it would be lowered down to the seafloor about 2.5 miles deep or so. And it would go chomping across the seafloor, sucking up manganese nodules. And it would be sort of stirring up this very fragile environment that's been dark and stable and cold for millennia. And the nodules, these manganese nodules, they lie sort of loose on the seafloor. They're like these like potato-sized rocks, and they contain nickel and cobalt and all these other rare earth elements that are very in demand for sustainable technologies. And they would get hoovered up to this waiting ship above. One of the biggest concerns with deep sea mining is, what happens after those nodules get up to the ship. The nodules would get plucked out, and then the tailings, so the dregs from the mining, would get pumped back down into the ocean. And those tailings could be filled with heavy metals and toxins from all the crushed ore. And these sediment plumes would just spread out over a vast area. The proposed mining sites in the Pacific, which is where most of this is happening, are really huge. The most popular mining site is about the size of Europe, but that's really nothing compared to how far tailings could spread. They could travel as little as 6 miles. That's what mining proponents say, but they could also travel hundreds of miles because there's no land or borders to stop them at sea. And so what this would do is it would fill a normally clear ecosystem with toxic dust that would, drag down things floating in the water column, like, jellyfish. It could suffocate filter feeding animals like clams and sponges. It could absorb the light of bioluminescent animals that need that light to feed and communicate. And it would also very likely impact the animals that are migrating through these mining sites, because again, they're huge. So turtles and tunas and whale sharks. And then, that will kind of connect back to us at that point, because if humans were to eat any of those animals, like tuna, for instance, the tuna would ingest the toxin, and then it would sort of work its way up the food chain. So throughout all the reporting I did, I finally had to answer this big question of, would CBID 2030 actually finish the first complete map of the seafloor on time? So by 2030. And the answer to that, a bit of a spoiler alert here, is no. CBID 2030 will very likely not finish the map on time. Just last week, they announced that it had now mapped 26% of the seafloor, and they've only got 6 years left to go, and there is just not enough progress being made to finish the map in time. The ocean is too big, there were too many delays from COVID, and there was also just no sort of political will or money or motivation to get this done. The CEO of Saildraone, that company that I visited in San Francisco, he actually said to me, just call it CBID 2090. It's not going to happen by 2030. But what's extraordinary to me is that we're still discovering things all the time on the ocean floor. A few months ago, a South Carolina exploration company may have discovered the final resting place of Amelia Earhart's plane by surveying 5,000 square miles of ocean. This is a picture of the world's largest deepwater coral reef. It was just discovered off of Florida and South Carolina. And then just 2 weeks ago, another ship of Ernest Shackleton's was discovered off the coast of Canada, the one that he died on. And so things like that are happening all the time, even though we've only mapped 26% of the ocean floor. And, when I look at pictures like this, I know that sometimes the seabed might look like this dark, scary, very inhospitable place. But I found while I was writing the deepest map that it's really the opposite. There's a lot of humanity down there. We've left a lot of humanity down there. There's, the distant past of shipwrecks and downed airplanes. There's the mysteries of where life on Earth began and where we came from. And I think there's also a lot of questions about our future and, where we're going, how we're going to explore in the future, what life might look like on distant planets, and whether we should mine the deep sea or not. And so for me, ocean mapping really became a quest to understand ourselves, where we came from and where we're going, and what it means to be human. Okay, great. And I'll just end it there and open up the floor to any questions. Thanks so much for listening so patiently through all that. Here's my website again if you'd like to get in touch. But also, I'm here for any questions you might have about ocean mapping and deep sea exploration.
If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute or type in the chat. The mics are open.
Hi. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for this great talk. I had kind of have a question in relation to the purpose of mapping the ocean floor itself. So in regards to all the reporting you've done and all the researchers you've spoken to, do you find that the main purpose is finding like the biology, wildlife on the seafloor? Is it more so for mapping the more physical or geological properties, or finding anything human down there? Is there an overarching purpose, or is it just kind of all over the map, so to speak?
Yeah, thanks so much for coming, Emma. It's good to see you.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, you know, it's a really wide range. So I assume you're probably asking about scientific expeditions, primarily, you know, because there's a really big motley crew of people who are out at sea. So, you know, there's government ships, there's private industry, but then the scientific research vessels, which are the ones that I was sort of most interested in, there would often be like a real mix of studies and fields going on. So the ship that I was on, the Nautilus, there were geologists on board, there were biologists on board. And what was really interesting was that a lot of the exploration on board that ship was actually funded by NASA, which people might think is sort of counterintuitive. You think NASA might be studying space, but they'd actually funded this cruise. We were doing mapping on board at the same time, but they had funded this cruise to look for a type of deep sea animal, foraminifera, and they're also called forams, and they don't require oxygen, and they live in these deep, dark basins. And NASA was investigating whether these would be good candidates to, you know, blast into space. So there would just be sort of random, you know, things that you would never expect people were researching. They were researching on board these ships. So it was really a mix. It didn't always break down into all biology or all geology or what have you.
Really interesting, and good you didn't get seasick. I don't know if I could say the same for myself.
Yeah, you have to go try it out.
Yes.
I have a question about the future, maybe. So you mentioned about the drones, and that's kind of really cool. Would they be just independent, or would we still have like traditional scientific survey ships? Is there an idea to like blend and come together so we have that modern technology with the old school wisdom or something like that? I'm sure.
Right. Yeah. I mean, right now we're starting to blend the drones and the traditional survey ships. If you talk to Sail Drone, they would probably say that blending is not happening quickly enough, that we could be doing more. And I think that it probably will happen, that we'll see more of a takeover of drones at sea, just because these operations can do incredible things. And they're just so much cheaper and so much easier than sending out a ship at sea. So, I mean, I was on a ship for 9 days with a crew of, you know, 10, 15 people, and we got 426 square kilometers of unmapped seafloor. So when you think about the cost and you think about the time involved, and sometimes we'd be like, I actually kind of helped the ocean mapper on board to sort of fix things and watch her start up the ocean mapping sonar and turn it back down, back off again. And, sometimes you're just like, I would be getting in sort of pipes and getting in the back end of things. And I'd be like, this is a crazy way of doing things. Is there not a better way to do this? So I would,
Right?
yeah.
Does
I
that
would have
include
thought
the
too.
submersibles?
Yeah,
Does that? Okay.
submersibles can do mapping as well, but they tend to do mapping that's hyper detailed. So the maps that we were making might have been like, 10 to 100 meters in resolution. And submersibles can do incredible mapping, like millimeters of resolution. So you can really kind of create this box on the seafloor and study every little thing within it. So
Wow.
that's a very different level. And there was someone also on board that ship who was doing these incredibly detailed maps. And he would just like laugh at what I called maps because he was making so much more detailed maps.
That's fascinating. I
Mhm.
thank you for that. Just the imagery of the deepest. I think that's so cool, the deeps. But I was also wondering about, you mentioned sonar travels very well through water. I find that counterintuitive. Like when I'm underwater, the sounds are all like muffled.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Have you ever been scuba diving or snorkeling and somebody sort of taps on the side of the boat nearby? On one of the trips that I did in Florida, we were doing some archaeological dives on the seafloor. And if there was ever a shark around, somebody would take something metal and bang the side of the ship to let us know. Luckily, it never happened, but they would sort of test it out for us. And then it would all of a sudden become clear how well sound traveled underwater. But yeah, if you just put your head underwater in a bathtub, you're like, this is very muffled. I do not understand how you would map this way. But those kind of specific pings, they can travel very well. Yeah.
and that's fascinating too. So
It
the
is.
sound hits the bottom and then it bounces back up. And then, like you said, all the different factors, the salinity and pressure and whatever. That I'm just fascinating. Thank you so much for taking me there tonight.
Oh,
Appreciate it.
thank
Thank
you.
you. I'm gonna let someone else ask a question.
Ooh, is it as hot in East Hampton as it is here in Hamilton? I'm very warm right now. But yeah, happy to take any other questions.
Hamilton in New York State or another
No,
state?
Hamilton in Canada, in Ontario.
Okay. I'm
Yeah.
in Hyde Park, New York. So I'm
Oh,
not
wow.
in the Hamptons. And I thank the East Hampton Library also that they offered this to me to be able to see it online. So it's fascinating to me. So we have a little less humidity today, so that was nice. It's still hot, but it was the humidity where I felt like I was living in Florida, and I don't know how they do it. I could never.
Yeah, I live in Hamilton now, but I wrote most of this book in San Diego, so not too far from Scripps Oceanography Institution. So there was a lot of nearby sort of opportunities around ocean exploration when I lived there. Now I'm living in along a Great Lake, which sometimes behaves like an ocean. But and there's actually something called Lake Bed 2030. So there's a whole
Oh,
group of researchers that are trying to map the entire bottom of all the Great Lakes by 2030. And they found some really interesting stuff in the Great Lakes as well. Some old ships that have disappeared and being rediscovered through historical news reports. But I think when I think about Lakebed 2030, I feel like that really drives home the point that Seabed 2030 is probably not going to happen. Like if we are only mapping 5 Great Lakes and we can only do that by 2030, then the idea of mapping the entire global ocean by 2030 seems a bit ambitious.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you there. I was thinking you just gave me an idea of like rivers. riverbeds and mapping rivers. I would wondering how accurate we are on those, again, because of the navigational probably purposes of those things.
Oh, I see a hand up from Cheryl.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to the library for arranging for Laura to speak with us. I wonder if you could just touch on who is going to regulate the mining of the sea. I know there's an organization that supposedly is developing new regulations or whatever, but I think this is an interesting aspect of the mining and the problems of the deep sea mining.
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. I didn't touch on the sort of regulatory sides of deep sea mining as much, but you're right. The majority of the ocean, 2/3 of the ocean, almost half of the surface of the planet falls in what's called international waters. So no country or person has any ownership rights over it. And that's probably one of the big reasons why we have so many challenges mapping it, because nobody owns it. People tend to map the things that they own and know what's in there. And if they don't own it, if it's a collective space, then we're probably not going to map it. So legally, the international seafloor belongs to the common heritage of mankind. So you own the seafloor and I own the seafloor and everybody owns this seafloor that's out there. And it's managed by this UN affiliated organization called the International Seabed Authority, which is based in Jamaica, and they're charged with regulating but also promoting seabed mining, which, like, you can probably see the conflict there between regulating and promoting seabed mining. And for years and years, the ISA was a really sleepy organization because deep sea mining was not really was not going to happen very quickly. You know, it started in the 70s and there's been fits and starts here and there of enthusiasm, but mainly people were kind of fascinated by the ISA because it was like this odd, curious organization that had just like a few dozen people working there, and it was in charge of over half the world's surface. But now, as deep sea mining is moving closer to reality, there's a lot more scrutiny of the ISA and, you know, how it's being funded, how it's being regulated. The New York Times last year put out a report about how the ISA had given out rich areas of the seafloor to certain companies, areas that were supposed to be reserved for poor countries. And that was sort of the great promise of seabed mining when it was first talked about in the 70s and 80s, that it could be this great equalizer between rich countries and poor countries. But it hasn't really worked out that way. It hasn't really delivered on that promise so far. So no one is actually allowed to commercially mine the seafloor just yet. So the ISA is not yet, I would say, it doesn't really have its reason to be at this point in time because there's no commercial mining. But if and when that does happen, then the ISA will be the one overseeing it. And when I actually visited the ISA in 2021 in Jamaica, and I was pretty shocked. I saw some of the mining companies were allowed to sit on the negotiating floor with government delegates, and were kind of mingling freely with all the other government delegates. And I was with the nonprofits at the sidelines, and we only had a chance to speak at certain points. Yeah, and there was just this big question kind of hovering over the whole meeting, which is that, like, you know, how can this mining regulator also be promoting mining and be dependent on mining to operate? So I think we're going to see a lot more questions around how that organization works and how we're going to oversee the international seafloor. And a lot of people just don't know that they have a stake in the international seafloor too, that we all do. So you know, maybe as things move closer to reality for seabed mining, then there'll be more awareness of that organization. John Oliver actually put out a really great video about deep sea mining. recently. So I would also recommend checking that out.
Do we have any other questions this evening? Well, I'd like to thank you, Laura, for a wonderful presentation. The Deepest Map is available in all local bookstores, Amazon.com, and if you're in East Hampton Library, we have a copy in our collection. I'd like to thank everybody for zooming in to this lecture this evening, and we wish everyone the best, and we'll see you again on the next talk.
Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Night.